The planet known as Winter Crucible greeted its new arrivals with a wind so sharp it felt sentient, gnawing through armor plates and slipping beneath insulated fabrics as if determined to test every layer of their resolves. Sergeant Ethan Ward stepped off the transport ramp with a quiet breath, the cold slicing at his face like a welcome he already understood. Around him, 19 alien recruits attempted to feign courage, but their shivering limbs betrayed them before the storm ever had a chance. Ethan's boots crunched into the frost with practiced certainty. He scanned the horizon, endless ice plains, serrated ridgelines, and the faint outline of the starting beacon half buried beneath drifting snow. It looked like Antarctica filtered through a nightmare. To him, this wasn't terrifying. It was familiar in the same unconquerable way Earth's winters had shaped those who dared challenge them. But the aliens viewing him from the corner of their eyes did not know that. All they saw was one human sent to a trial that swallowed entire platoons. Commander Vurask loomed at the front, towering overmost like a muscle-packed crocodilian statue brought to life. His breath came out as thick vapor, the cold-blooded warrior visibly struggling despite the furious determination burning in his eyes. "Human," he growled, his voice vibrating through his scaled chest. "Your species should protest this insult. A single member sent to an elite trial? This is suicide dressed as bravado." Ethan just offered a half-smile. "Or maybe we don't need more than one." The cold made the reptilian warrior recoil slightly, though whether from the temperature or the human's confidence was unclear. Beside Vurask, the feline soldier Ferran flexed stiffening fingers, fighting to keep his claws from locking. His agile frame trembled under his thermal armor. "He boasts now," Ferran said, breath whistling between his sharp teeth. "But when the sun falls and the Real freeze begins, he'll beg to be extracted." Ethan didn't bother responding. Arguments were energy drains, and he preferred saving every calorie for what mattered. Instead, he paced forward, observing the terrain with a hunter's eye. The ground dipped slightly to the left, wind channel. The ice crust to the right stacked in sheets, pressure fractures. A jagged ridge ahead hid what looked like a cave mouth. All of it filed silently into his mind, becoming part of a plan that hadn't yet revealed itself to anyone else. Joruin, the stone-skinned brute with arms like carved pillars, took one heavy step onto the ice and cracked the surface beneath him. He laughed, a deep reverberation that sent flakes tumbling from his shoulders. "This world will not break me," he declared. "I am carved from worlds colder and harder than this." Ethan didn't correct him. Stone-skinned species often made assumptions about heat retention. They rarely understood how rapidly their dense frames bled warmth under prolonged cold. That ignorance would matter soon. The exam overseer's voice boomed through the storm from the loudspeakers embedded in the departure platform. "Candidates, the Frozen Hell Endurance trial begins now. Survive 12 days. No external assistance will be provided. The landscape is your only ally or your final enemy. Proceed." A blinding gust swept across the field as the platform lights clicked off one by one. Winter Crucible reclaimed the silence instantly. Snow drifted sideways, forming whirling halos around every figure. The group moved out, the aliens stumbling in the uneven terrain while Ethan charted a deliberate pace. Within 30 minutes, the first signs of trouble appeared. Frost clung stubbornly to Ferran's whiskers, freezing them into rigid icicles. His graceful gait became jittery. Vurask slowed, his scales losing their sheen as his internal temperature dropped. Even the massive Joruin showed hairline fractures forming along the joints of his stony forearms. Drackle, the insectoid strategist, clicked his mandibles anxiously. "These conditions are illogical," he muttered. "The briefing promised survivable temperatures. This is far closer to systemic failure levels." Ethan adjusted the strap of his pack, but said nothing. The aliens were learning the lesson on their own. Survivable in galactic standards did not account for a human's definition of livable, nor Earth's tradition of thriving in misery. Another gust hammered the group, and 2 recruits stumbled to their knees. Ethan pivoted toward a slight depression in the terrain and began pushing toward it. The others hesitated. "Where do you think you're going, human?" Durask snarled, though his voice carried a tremor now. Out of the wind. He didn't have to check if they followed. Instinct eventually overpowered ego. Within moments, the group clustered around him in the shallow dip. It provided minimal shelter, but for most of them, even a minor reduction in exposure was a blessing. Ethan knelt and brushed his gloved fingers across the snow. Beneath the top layer, the snow compressed differently, denser, freshly drifted. Perfect for cutting blocks. He began carving out small cubes with a compact tool, forming the first step of something none of the others could yet recognize. Ferran squinted, breath shaking. "What are you doing?" "This isn't the exam location. This is barely half a kilometer from the start." "Exactly," Ethan replied. He set another block aside. "Storm's ramping up too fast. If you keep walking for pride, you'll freeze before sunset." Drackle emitted a soft buzz of disbelief. "Walking is the requirement. Surviving is the requirement." The insectoid fell silent. Ethan continued his work with quiet precision, stacking snow blocks with practiced efficiency. His motions were clipped, economical. Every cut mattered, every angle served a purpose. The aliens watched, baffled, unable to comprehend how the fragile-looking human moved so deliberately in conditions that made their own bodies falter. As he worked, Jorwin suddenly exhaled, a crack running along his stone forearm like a fissure through granite. He stared at it in horror. Durask stumbled, his limbs slower now, tail dragging. Ferran's pupils had narrowed into pinpoints as the cold gnawed at his extremities. Ethan looked up briefly. "You're all freezing. If you want to live through the first night, start helping. Or, at the very least, stop wasting heat." The words struck them harder than the wind. Not insult, truth. One by one, the male recruits stepped closer, desperation outweighing pride. They didn't yet understand the structure Ethan was building, or why he chose this location, or how he stayed calm while their nerves frayed to breaking. But they sensed something vital. The human wasn't improvising. He was executing knowledge they didn't possess. By the time the sky dimmed into a dull, frozen twilight, Ethan had carved a partial windbreak, a foundation, and an entrance tunnel. The others stood beside him, shivering violently, murmuring weak protests or questions he didn't answer yet. He stepped back and surveyed the beginnings of the shelter. Primitive, incomplete, but right. A foothold against a world designed to kill everything unprepared. The storm's howl intensified, sweeping across the plains like a monstrous exhale. Snow began to rise around them in swirling sheets. Ethan met the eyes of the shivering aliens. "This is the line," he said quietly. "You cross it with me, or the cold takes you before morning." None of them argued. The storm swallowed the horizon whole as the group huddled behind the half-built wall, a fragile. The storm escalated with a cruelty that felt deliberate, slamming into the half-built structure like a living wall trying to crush the fragile defiance beneath it. Snow whirled across the plain in thick, twisting sheets. Ethan pushed into the wind, shoulders braced and jaw locked, carving another block of compacted ice with a precision not even the storm could derail. The temperature was plummeting by the minute, and the aliens behind him were deteriorating even faster. Durask crouched low, his scaled limbs barely responding to his commands. Every breath he exhaled frosted instantly across his jaw, forming a thin mask of ice. "Human," he rasped, voice cracking under the strain. "This construction of yours better be more than a wall of snow." "It's the beginning of heat," Ethan replied. He lifted a block, fitted it with a practiced twist, and sealed the seam with powdered frost. "If I stop now, you'll be dead in half an hour." The reptilian commander's pride flickered under the weight of truth. He didn't argue further. Ferran stood close to the center of the group, trying to fold his body into itself for warmth. His feline muscles twitched uncontrollably, movements jerky and weak. "My claws. I can't even retract them anymore." He shot a panicked glance toward Ethan. "This is only the first day. What monster designed this exam?" "Someone who wanted to know who adapts," Ethan said, "not who postures." Drackle, his exoskeleton cracking with cold, clicked his mandibles anxiously. We need a heat source, he insisted. Even with shelter, survival demands. I know, Ethan interrupted, not unkindly, but without indulgence for panic. I'm working on it. He knelt, brushing snow aside until the bare ice beneath reflected the dim twilight. He had noticed the subtle rise of vapor earlier, a sign of weak geothermal bleed-through. Barely enough to warm a hand, but enough to anchor a solution. Ethan retrieved a collapsible thermal sheet from his pack, its reflective surface shimmering in the drifting light. The alien stared as he pinned it around the depression, angling it with meticulous care. Each movement was controlled, deliberate. The structure grew. A dome of carved blocks reinforced by snow-packed ridges, an entrance tunnel twisting inward to trap heat, a reflective ceiling angled to catch even the faintest emission rising from the earth. To the aliens, it looked like magic. To Ethan, it was simply physics and experience. Jorwin shuffled closer, his stone skin splitting again with a sharp crack. He winced, an expression rare for his species. How does a flesh creature know so much about cold? He managed, voice low and rough. Ethan didn't look up. Where I'm from, winter kills the unprepared. You learn fast or you don't make it to adulthood. Vurask stared at him with something new in his eyes, respect tinged with unease. Your world must be a savage place. Sometimes, Ethan said, but it teaches you things no academy can. A violent tremor shot through Ferran's limbs. He staggered, nearly dropping to his knees. Ethan reached out, steadying him without hesitation. Inside, he ordered. All of you. The shelter wasn't finished, but it was far enough. Part of survival was knowing when to stop building and start protecting. Ethan ushered them through the narrow tunnel one by one. The interior felt cramped with so many bodies, but their combined heat began to nudge the temperature upward. Drackle tapped the inner wall, antennae trembling. This actually insulates. How did you? Stack geometry, pressure sealing, and convection control. Ethan adjusted the reflective sheet overhead. Humans figured it out a few thousand years ago. The insectoid blinked. Thousands? We've been dealing with freezing deaths since before the first civilizations. The aliens fell silent. Their assumptions about humans, soft, fragile, primitive, were dissolving beneath the weight of lived experience they had never imagined. Outside, the storm's howl intensified into a roar, every gust slamming into the shelter with enough force to rattle the inner walls. Ethan pressed a hand against the entrance. The structure held, but barely. He reinforced the inner seal with packed snow and clipped the thermal sheet in place. The temperature rose another degree. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't death. Jorwin exhaled in visible relief as his cracking skin began to stabilize. Vurask laid his heavy body against the wall, conserving energy. Ferran curled near the reflective surface, tail wrapped tightly around his legs. Drackle calculated their survival odds in a muttering whisper, but even he sounded cautiously optimistic. Ethan sat with his back against the entrance, body shielding the weakest point of the structure. His breath steamed in faint plumes. He closed his eyes for a moment, not resting, just thinking. They had made it this far, but the exam had barely begun. Temperatures would drop further. Some species would decline rapidly. Food reserves would shrink. And the coalition had designed this trial to push recruits until the line between endurance and death blurred beyond recognition. The shelter would not be enough for long. Ethan tapped his fingertips against his knee, calculating possibilities. He could build a more efficient heat battery using chemical packs and insulated stone. If he scavenged more reflective material from the standard issue gear, he could increase thermal retention by 30%. The cave he'd glimpsed earlier might hold natural geothermal vents. Or predators. Or both. Still, he needed it. The aliens watched him, sensing his mind turning even if they couldn't understand the details. Ferran shifted uneasily. Human? Ethan, he said quietly, the first time he'd used his name. Will this shelter hold until morning? It'll hold, Ethan said. Then he added, because false hope was crueler than truth, but it won't be enough for the next storm. A hollow silence filled the compact shelter. Vurask's eyes narrowed. There will be another? Always, Ethan replied. This planet doesn't let up. And the exam planners know exactly when to trigger the worst of it. Drakel's mandibles clicked nervously. Then what do you propose? Ethan opened his eyes, a steady resolve glowing behind them. We use this storm to stay alive tonight. Tomorrow, we build something stronger. Something that can actually produce heat, not just trap it. The aliens exchanged uncertain glances. None of their species had ever adapted to such hostile conditions. None understood cold beyond avoidance. But the human spoke with the conviction of someone who didn't merely believe he would survive. He expected to. The storm reached a crescendo outside, shaking the shelter violently. Snow filtered through a crack in the entrance. Ethan reinforced it with a swift, decisive motion. The group huddled closer, surrounded by cold, but held together by the fragile miracle a human had carved out of a nightmare. For now, that was enough. But Ethan's thoughts stayed fixed on what came next, and the growing certainty that they had not yet met the true danger of winter crucible. The second night announced itself with an unnatural stillness, the sort of silence that predators and storms share just before they strike. Ethan felt at the moment he stepped outside the shelter to check the snowpack. The air seemed to hold its breath, suspended between darkness and danger. His instincts prickled. Winter crucible wasn't done with them, not even close. Behind him, the aliens lingered inside the cramped dome, bodies pressed together to preserve what little warmth they had. Vurask stirred first, his scaled face emerging from the entry tunnel with sluggish determination. Human, he rasped, voice still hoarse from cold. Is the storm weakening? No, Ethan said, brushing frost from his gloves. It's waiting. Jorwin crawled out next, cracks webbing across his stone arms like brittle fault lines. Waiting for what? The coldest night yet, Ethan replied. And we're nowhere near ready. The truth hung between them like a death sentence. The temperature had dropped enough that their breath froze midair, forming sparkling motes that drifted downward like shattered glass. Drakel ventured a few steps from the shelter, antennae twitching violently. This cold defies logic, the insectoid muttered. No data predicted these fluctuations. Data doesn't matter here, Ethan said. Only survival does. He began assessing their surroundings, scanning for anything that might aid them. The sky, once a bruised twilight, had dimmed into a spectral darkness. Even Ferran, whose senses typically excelled in low light, squinted in confusion when he emerged. I can't smell anything, the feline admitted quietly, nose twitching. The air is dead. Not dead, Ethan corrected. Frozen. As if summoned by his words, the first tremor rippled across the ice field, a low vibration that reverberated through their boots. The group flinched. Ferran's fur bristled. Jorwin instinctively raised his arms. What was that? Vurask growled, alert now despite his frozen joints. Cold shift, Ethan answered. Pressure drop beneath the crust. When the temperature changes too fast, the ice cracks like a collapsing roof. Another tremor surged beneath them, deeper this time, rolling outward like thunder trapped underground. Ethan's pulse quickened. If the crust fractured near their shelter, it could swallow them without warning. He turned back toward the dome. Inside. Now. They scrambled toward the entrance, their panic unmasked and raw. Ethan sealed the tunnel behind them and reinforced the inner layers while they huddled in suffocating silence. The shelter creaked. The storm hadn't begun, yet the temperature continued to fall. Frost coated the walls in delicate, branching patterns. Jorwin's forehead dimmed, the natural glow of his mineral core weakening with every passing minute. Ferran curled tightly, claws trembling as if fused to the air. Drakel tried to maintain composure, though his mandibles chattered uncontrollably. Even Vurask, proud, unshakable, arrogant Vurask, held his rigid arms against his chest, shivering like a failing engine. Ethan lit a small chemical warmer and placed it at their center. The reaction flickered weakly, barely enough to lift the temperature a fraction of a degree. But to the aliens, it felt like salvation. This will not last, Drakel whispered. We need more heat. And we'll get it, Ethan said, though even he felt the razor edge of doubt pressing into his thoughts. The storm hit without warning. A deafening blast slammed into the shelter, shaking snow from the ceiling in a shimmering cascade. The walls bowed inward, straining against the unimaginable force. Ferran clamped his hands over his ears, tail thrashing in panic. Drackle pressed himself against the wall, antennae flattening in instinctive terror. Vurask growled low, the sound trembling with something dangerously close to fear. Ethan braced his palms against the entrance wall as the wind roared like a colossal beast trying to claw its way inside. Snow pounded against the structure, each gust threatening to tear apart the delicate balance holding them alive. The storm howled again, this time accompanied by a distant, echoing crack. Jorwin stiffened. Another ice fracture? No, Ethan breathed. Something bigger. The ground lurched beneath them. The entire shelter tilted, the floor sliding as if the world itself had shifted sideways. The aliens scrambled for balance. Ice groaned in every direction. The tunnel collapsed with a muffled thud, sealing them in complete darkness. For a moment, no one breathed. A single, hairline fracture crept down the wall beside Vurask, glowing faintly as the frigid air funneled through it. "We're going to be buried alive," Ferran whispered, voice cracking. "Not if you stay calm," Ethan said. He pressed his ear against the crack, listening to the pressure beyond the wall. The storm wasn't stopping, it was accelerating. "We wait it out. When it slows, we dig." Drackle's mandibles clacked. "What if the air runs out?" "It won't," Ethan answered. "This shelter breathes. The vents are layered. They won't clog." Vurask narrowed his ice-frosted eyes. "You sound certain." "I am." The aliens clung to his certainty, like a lifeline. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The shelter shook, groaned, and trembled. Ice cracked somewhere above them. Snow filtered in through unseen seams. The cold pressed against them like a living force, invasive and relentless. Then, slowly, mercifully, the storm's fury ebbed. The howling softened into a ghostly moan. The ground stilled. The pressure dissipated. Ethan exhaled. "That's our window." He clawed at the collapsed tunnel, snow cascading around his arms. Vurask and Ferran helped despite shaking limbs. Jorwin stabilized the roof, using his heavy body as a brace. Drackle shoveled snow aside with rapid, desperate strokes. After agonizing minutes, a sliver of faint light broke through, a dull, muted glow barely cutting through the frost. Ethan punched through the final layer and pulled himself upward. Cold air slapped his face, but it was breathable, survivable.
He surveyed the landscape.
Bodies, 3 of them, lay frozen in the open, covered in crystalline frost. Other shelters had collapsed entirely. The storm had not just tested them, it had culled them. Vurask hauled himself from the tunnel beside Ethan. When he saw the corpses, his jaw clenched. "We would be among them," he admitted, voice subdued, "if not for you." Ethan didn't answer. He was already scanning the horizon. Something in the distance glinted strangely beneath the depleted storm clouds. Ferran emerged, eyes narrowing. "What is that?" Ethan squinted, heart tightening with a new, uneasy certainty. "Not weather," he murmured. "Not terrain." The wind whispered across the plains, carrying a faint metallic hum. The exam wasn't the only thing hunting them on this frozen world. The corridor lights dimmed as the training deck sealed behind them, isolating the 3 men in a hush that felt heavier than the silence itself. Commander Rourke walked ahead without looking back, his posture carved from authority and irritation, while Kane followed with the uneasy certainty that whatever waited beyond the next door would not resemble a debrief. The clang of Captain Idren's boots punctuated the space between them, sharp and controlled, as though he refused to let his temper make a sound. Rourke stopped at a reinforced hatch and pressed his hand against the panel. The lock disengaged with a low groan, opening into a narrow observation chamber overlooking the main drill atrium. Kane recognized the room instantly. New recruits called it the Crucible Box, a place where truths were pulled out of men whether they wanted them or not. Rourke entered first, letting the others gather around the angled glass where the atrium spread wide below, its polished floor still marked by scorch lines from earlier simulations. "I don't like unknown variables in my program," Rourke said. His gaze remained fixed on the empty floor. "And you, Kane, are turning into a cluster of them." Kane steadied his breath. "Sir, I followed the scenario parameters exactly as assigned." "No," Rourke replied. "You interpreted them. There's a difference." Idrin crossed his arms, his broad silhouette rigid as a statue beside the window. "The brute strength display was unnecessary," he stated. "Impressive, yes, but undirected. Controlled aggression is an asset. Reckless escalation is not." Kane faced them both. "I wasn't escalating anything." She struck first. Rourke finally turned to him. "That alien instructor could have snapped your spine if she wanted to. So here's the question. Why didn't she?" Kane blinked, unsure. "Sir, because she underestimated me?" Rourke's expression hardened with something between annoyance and concern. "Or because she was testing thresholds. Limits. Yours and hers. And you shattered her baton like it was brittle wood, through armor meant to disperse kinetic force." Kane's jaw tightened. He hadn't fully processed it himself. The impact had felt natural, as though something in him had known exactly how to move. No hesitation. No calculation. Just instinct. Idrin shifted his stance. "There's more," he added. "Your biometrics during the altercation. They spiked beyond human standard and then normalized too quickly. That's not training adaptation. That's something else." A chill seeped under Kane's skin. "I don't understand. Are you suggesting I'm not?" "No one's suggesting anything yet," Rourke cut in, though his tone contradicted the reassurance. "But anomalies attract attention, and attention attracts interference." He tapped a control on the console. A holographic feed flickered into the air, displaying fragments of the earlier fight, grainy, slowed, focused on Kane's movement at the moment of the strike. It looked unreal even to him. His arm blurred, armor plates compressing in a pattern he had never been trained to replicate. A shockwave pulsed outward upon impact, visible even in the low-resolution playback. Idrin nodded toward the projection. "Explain that." Kane stared at it helpless. "I can't." Rourke let the recording play twice before shutting it off. "Which means we have a situation. A potentially dangerous one." Kane felt his pulse hammer in his throat. "If you think I'm compromised or a threat, just say it." "If I thought you were a threat," Rourke replied calmly, "you wouldn't be standing here." The words weren't comforting. They were a reminder that Kane was under scrutiny, and men like Rourke did not misjudge threats, they removed them. The commander approached him, voice lowering. "But I'm not willing to hand you off to fleet science or intelligence until I know exactly what we're dealing with. They'd carve you apart before they ever asked the right questions." Idrin nodded silently, as if confirming the severity of that truth. Kane swallowed. "So what now?" Rourke stepped back toward the window, his reflection layered over the atrium below. "Now," he said, "you're going to show us what you can do. Not in a simulation. Not in a controlled drill." He pressed another sequence on the console. The atrium floor shifted, panels retracting to reveal a deep, circular pit filled with an array of shifting platforms and armored drones powering up with a rising hum. "You're going down there." Kane stiffened. "Sir, that's a live adaptive arena. Those drones hit with full force." "That's the point," Idrin said, soft but firm. "We need to see what happens when you're pushed, not by an opponent testing you, but by a system designed to break you." Kane breathed out slowly, forcing his mind to settle. Fear hovered at the edges of his thoughts, but beneath it was something else, something sharper, a pulse of adrenaline that felt almost like anticipation. Rourke watched him closely. "If there's a limit, we need to find it before someone else does." Kane nodded once, the decision locking into place inside him. "I'll go." Rourke opened the chamber hatch leading downstairs, but paused, voice steady yet weighted.
"Kane.
Whatever happens down there, don't hold back. Not this time." Kane met his gaze. "I wasn't holding back before." Rourke's eyes tightened, as though that was exactly what he feared. Kane stepped through the doorway, the hum of the awakening arena echoing through the metal corridors, drawing him forward like the breath before a storm. The pit awaited him, shifting, alive, ready to reveal whatever truth he had been carrying unknowingly inside his own bones. As he descended the final steps, the lights intensified, and the drones aligned their sensors on him in unison. For the first time, Kane felt the ground beneath him respond, not to his weight, but to something deeper. Something that had been waiting. The arena gates sealed behind him. The hum surged. And then the floor moved.